now listening to the Film Monsters podcast with Nate and Ray.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Film Monsters podcast. I'm Nate.
And I am Ray.
Are you sure? Did you take your replicant test before you came?
I mean, I'll never tell.
And we're back with another science fiction episode. Ray, I had a lot of fun last week. It was funny. We talked about Sunshine, and I know that I had some issues with the movie, but I was actually talking to a couple people about it, and I think that it's a movie that does hold its validity in like how interesting and unique it is. And I actually was saying I'm excited to watch it again just to see what I pull from it from a second viewing, and I thought we had a really good conversation about it.
Yeah, it was good. Like I said, it's always nice to kind of hear someone else's perspective, because then when you rewatch it, it kind of puts the film in a different light. So that's always nice, because the point of film is for you to be able to experience new feelings and emotions, and when you have like a different perspective, it changes things, and it makes the film more interesting on other viewings.
So Ray and I obviously are talking about science fiction films, and we're having a lot of fun with it. And obviously, if you listen to last week's episode, today's episode is about Her. But I thought before we got started talking about Her, it would be fun to talk about another series of movies that are in a similar vein to the subject matter when you look at it on a deeper level. And because Ray recommended it in an early episode, I thought it would be fun to talk about both of the Blade Runner movies, since I sat down and rewatched them. And Ray, I will tell you, I really liked the original Blade Runner, but I loved 2049, as in like one of the best movies I've ever seen.
I did a ranking just on my own private social media a long time ago of like my favorite movies of the decade, and that one was my number one.
It's 100% deserving to be one of the best films ever, and I think it's kind of a shame that it flopped so hard in the box office, because I really feel like obviously there's a large gap in time, and science fiction is a pretty niche genre that I feel like there's a certain group of people who really love it. But I think a lot of fans of the Ridley Scott original were probably hesitant to go watch it, because at the time, Denis Villeneuve is this enormous presence in the scene now. And I know he did films like Arrival and Enemy and Prisoners that were really well liked in the independent community, but this was really Denis' first shot at like taking a big property and making a film about it. And I truly think that he took everything about the original that made the original interesting, but made it much more engaging and better in literally every way.
Yeah, I feel like the original one, as incredible as it is, there are some like moments where it just kind of feels like they're trying to fill up space.
Yes,
and in this
it's
one,
slow.
it's slow. Some of the characters aren't as likable. Like Deckard is awesome, but he's kind of a jerk throughout the entire movie. He's just this ornery. He's just basically playing Harrison Ford. And, I feel like in 2049, you have Gosling and Ana de Armas, who their relationship between Joy and Kay is so it's at the front and center and the heart of the movie for a good chunk of it, that you follow this really emotional thing. Because something that I really loved about 2049, in the original Blade Runner, the replicants are seen more as these kind of angry and disgruntled, causing chaos. But in 2049, you get a sense of the replicants are actually have heart. They have emotions. They have feelings. You have more of an emotional connection. Even from the very beginning, when Kay hunts down Sapper Morton, and he was like, you never witnessed a miracle. You just get these really emotional cues from all the characters. And that emotion that the replicants have is something that you don't get a lot of on the original Blade Runner.
No, other than Rutger Hauer's character, who I would argue in the original Blade Runner is my favorite character in the film. And he doesn't even really get that much screen time. I feel like most of his stuff is at about the last 25 minutes to half hour of the film. In 2049, I think you nailed it on the head. I think there's so much more emotion involved, where you see these replicants as what they are, which is essentially human. They can feel emotion. I think what's so interesting about 2049 is how when you're introduced into this world that they discuss, like, okay, the Blade Runners now are going after older model replicants, not the newer model replicants, because the newer model replicants are essentially designed to be subservient. That is in their design and their programming. And so the Blade Runners are hunting down the older models because those are the ones who are acting out, so to speak.
Right. But then you still have this sense of like your regular crowd still just hates replicants all around, which I thought was interesting considering that they were supposed to serve humanity, but now they're so hated by the people. You see, you get on that scene where he's walking into the police station, and the guy kind of tries to taunt them and calls him a skin job because that's like the derogatory term for replicants. And then they got the perfect guy to play. Ryan Gosling is so good at playing these like really subdued type characters that you almost could feel for the guy. You could feel that even though he's this replicant that supposedly is just doing his job as a Blade Runner, he is still you can feel in him that he just desperately wants something more. And I think that's why he takes such a kinship to Joy, Ana de Armas' character.
And I think what's interesting, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up Blade Runner in this context in this episode, is because obviously when we get into discussing her, you have this idea of human being having a relationship with like a sentient artificial intelligence. And in this movie, you have a replicant, Ryan Gosling's character, who has human tendencies, presents as a human being, who is in love with essentially like a hologram of Ana de Armas, who's like genuinely cares and loves him as a person. And I love when he says, "Hey, I got you a present," and he brings home that stick that gives her the ability to move in the outside world. And I do think the way Denis Villeneuve writes their relationship is incredibly beautiful, and it adds this whole other layer of, is this wrong in the eyes of humanity? And even looking at it through the eyes of like Deckard's relationship with Rachel, and like a replicant and a human being having a relationship together, and is that okay, so to speak? And it's like, at the end of the day, if it's making someone happy and it's not harming anybody else, who really cares? I think Ana de Armas' character is probably one of my favorite characters in the film next to Ryan Gosling. I feel like she just gives such an amazing performance, and every time she's on screen, she's just electric. Like, I was watching it and I was like, oh, every time she would show up, I was so immersed and impressed with her performance.
I really loved Gosling's, because he is so subdued most of the movie, and then he has these key moments in the movie where you see him show anger and frustration, and those moments were so powerful. There are two specific moments, one at the end where they're by the seawall, you know what I'm talking about, and the other one when he's in that white room talking to the dream maker. And those scenes are so powerful because he's such a subdued character throughout the whole movie. And then those moments are so filled with emotions because he genuinely felt one way, and being torn away from him was so harsh, and you felt for him.
Yes, I love both of those intense moments you're talking about, but I think too that the more subdued emotions that he gives throughout the film, especially the scenes where he would have a flashback about his youth and being bullied by those kids. I felt like every time he would have those flashbacks and the camera would cut back to his facial expressions, you can almost see it behind his eyes. And there's something about the way Ryan Gosling commands the screen that he, especially in this movie in particular, that anytime something's going on with his character, you see so much emotion just in his eyes and his body language. And throughout the film, that really takes a precedent. So in those moments you're talking about, Ray, where he really flips the switch and that emotion is so present that you really feel it. And especially that scene at the end by the water, I feel like you feel it so much to where it's you can't take your eyes off the screen. It's so palpable. And I think this movie is just amazing. Ray and I could have done an entire episode about it, but I think between the performances, the cinematography, the score, it's just a masterpiece. And you feel like it was a movie I watched that I felt like you don't get a lot of movies like this anymore, that are these bigger budget spectacle films that are attached to an older franchise, that really add something new and unique to the idea of what the original Blade Runner was. And I know they've done like a spin-off now that's like an animated series, but I wish that this movie would have done better in the box office, because I feel like Denis Villeneuve could have, even if it wasn't these same characters, could have gone into this world and created more material that would still be just as immersive and engaging as 2049.
I'd like to see that whole story of Sapper Morton when he rescues Deckard and Rachel's daughter.
Yes, that would be amazing. I think that would be so interesting. And this world is so immersive in this idea of K isn't the only Blade Runner. There's multiple Blade Runners. So I feel like you could get so many side stories and so many more interesting characters that you don't even necessarily have to follow the same people. It's just the world and the thing that's created behind this company and making these replicants. It's just a world I never wanted to leave. So that is Ray and I's huge recommendation to obviously watch the original Blade Runner. It's going to be really hard for you. You could watch 2049 without seeing the original Blade Runner, but I don't feel like it's going to resonate the same. But just go watch both of these movies. I literally watched them back to back, and it was such an amazing experience. Ray, would you agree with Blade Runner that they should probably watch the final cut? I feel like that's probably the best bet.
Yeah, it's also the most accessible one to find. You don't have to go through a big homework. Like, you can find that one very easily. I've seen all 5 cuts. And yeah, the final cut is definitely the one. After watching all 5 cuts, yeah, that's the one I would go for.
Now we're going to get into today's topic, which last week we discussed the film Sunshine, which Ray recommended in our sci-fi recommendation episodes. And this week we're going to talk about the film I recommended, which is Spike Jonze's Her, which is a film that Ray has been trying to watch for an eternity, and he finally sat down to watch it. And so, Ray, before we do what we did with Sunshine and we get into deep diving it, I obviously love this movie. It's a movie that's really important to me. After rewatching it this time, I think I realized it just really is one of my favorite films ever made. I feel like it would be in my top 3, as you would say, for Blade Runner 2049. And I just want you to give your initial thoughts on it before we get into discussing it in length.
I want to start off by saying one thing, though. So I watched the movie, and like a day later, my house got hit. It got hit by a thunder. So, cursed movie.
Well, hey, at least it didn't burn your house down.
No, but
that would have made it worse.
No, but I have a leak in my roof now.
Oh God, it's all because of Spike Jonze.
But it was worth it because I freaking loved this movie so much. It was the worst possible movie to watch before going to see my therapist, though.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yes. Not a good lead up to that. 100% no.
But it was incredible. Like I wasn't sure what to expect. Like, I was expecting a good movie, obviously, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be like a feel good movie, like a heartbreak movie, like a downer or an upper. And it was all of it at once. And my brain has never been more confused in the best of ways.
100%. I feel like you summed it up perfectly. It's a movie that tears me down and builds me up at the same time. And I think I said this when I rewrote my Letterboxd rewatch review, but it's one of those movies that actually, like, every time I finish watching it, we've obviously talked about this on the podcast a couple times, but Ray and I both deal with some mental health issues. We both deal with like anxiety problems and depression, and I feel like this is one of those movies that really like gives me this overwhelming sense of optimism and actual like excitement to be alive, which not a lot of movies can do that. But despite there being some downer moments, I feel like this movie does give you a glimmer of hope and gives you a look into the future that isn't so bleak and awful like some science fiction movies where it's like, oh, the future isn't that bright. This movie does give you that glimmer of hope even when you have like some more depressing moments.
Oh, absolutely. Obviously, there's an overarching theme about this AI technology, but there's also this really big push on the importance of human connection, and there's still connecting with a human, still being able to have that emotional connection with like a palpable being. You see throughout the movie, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, you see so many scenes much like you see today of people walking around looking at their phones, talking to their phones and not to each other.
I will say, though, I think a fantastic contrast to that that's really interesting, and we'll get to that in the movie, but there's a scene where Joaquin Phoenix's character is in like a heated conversation towards the third act of the film, and he falls down, and all those people on their phones actually get up and help him up, which I thought was really interesting, that for a society that's so connected, they're still so willing to help. And I do feel like even though people are connected, it seems like the world is much more of like an accepting and inviting place. Like, this movie has a very warm feel to it. It's not like it doesn't feel like a bleak type of future. It feels like a very inviting, like it's winter and you're sitting by the fire or something, like just as a very like calming feeling, where it feels like people are much more accepting, and even like in their interactions with one another, it feels much more inviting, even though there is that motif of people being so invested in their technology.
Right. So, you know, we can go on about our thoughts all day, but do you wanna kick things off and get going about the plot of it?
Yes, absolutely. And before we get started, as Ray did before our Sunshine episode, spoilers from here on out. You can't really talk about this movie in depth without spoiling it. So if you haven't seen the 2013 film Her from Spike Jonze, go watch it and then come back and listen to Ray and I's thoughts about it, because I'm sure we're both going to have a lot to say.
Yes, so let's do this.
This film starts off with our lead character, Theodore Twombly, who is played by Joaquin Phoenix. And he's this guy who is very to himself. He is quiet. He's mild-mannered, but he's also a very, from the looks of it, empathetic and caring individual. And we're introduced in the near future of Los Angeles, which the set design and the production of this film is beautiful. We'll talk about that more as we go through the film. And he lives alone. He's going through a divorce with his childhood sweetheart, Catherine, who is played by Rooney Mara. And he's going through the divorce. We get a little bit of information into it at the beginning of the film. And he works for this company, which is the first thing I want to talk about, where he handwrites, quote unquote, handwrites letters for couples. And what he does is he gets like photographs from them, or little situations or things about their personalities, and he'll go and he writes these love letters or birthday cards or anything for people. And what's so fascinating about Ray talking about like the society's connection with technology, he doesn't actually handwrite them. He talks into a computer, and the computer handwrites them and then prints them on a sheet to make them look handwritten. But it is very much said early on that Joaquin is the best one at this job. Like, people love his letters. They say he's absolutely incredible at it. And that's how we're introduced to his character.
Something that I thought was really fascinating too, though, is that like Joaquin Phoenix, like his character talks about how he's been writing letters for some of these couples for years. So he is almost just as part of their life because of all of these letters he has written for people. So I thought that was really interesting, that it's not just something he does like, oh, a cool novelty gift. Like, he's actually involved in these people's lives as he's writing these letters for them, which I thought that was a cool concept, because when you first explained it to me, I thought it was like, oh, it's like a novelty thing, like, you know, you bought a cool painting from someone. But no, it's like he actually knows these people's life stories, and he is actually, even though he doesn't know them face to face, he is, you know, emotionally invested in these people's relationships.
And I think it also adds an even larger commentary on the whole like society and technology thing, because, you know, if you look as far back in science fiction as like George Orwell's 1984, where I feel like Orwell predicted emojis, where he's like, hey, we're gonna get to a point in our society where people won't even use full sentences to describe how they're feeling to each other. It'll just be like little one-word blurbs or something, which is literally where we are in society now. That this future is to a point where people want to express how they feel about someone else, but they can't, so they hire someone else to do it. And I thought that was so fascinating and such an interesting commentary on like even these people who like care about their significant other so much don't necessarily know how to express it in a correct way, and so they hire someone else to do it. And clearly from the looks of it and the amount of staff members that they have, it's a pretty booming business. It seems like it's doing really well and that people really love it.
I think that's such a fascinating topic too, because like if you look at our reality, our day and age, 2022 now, how many people have become involved with like, say vinyl or fashion from like the 90s and the 80s, or cassettes are making a comeback. It's like the longing that people have for something tangible, for something, that isn't just a digital file online, but like something more tangible. You have companies like the Criterion Collection or Arrow Videos that they produce like these tangible objects for art. So I don't think they're that far off with people really craving these like beautifully handwritten and intimate letters from people. I don't think that's that far off from where our society is.
No, you're 100% right. I agree. I feel like that's 100% a thing I could see happening. Also, speaking of what you said, because I think that you made a really great point, this idea of fashion sense, I think the clothing choices for the characters in this film is so interesting. It does feel like fashion from another era, and just like in the people who are walking by, obviously Theodore's clothing, I feel like he's dressed almost as someone from like the 70s most of the time. Like his outfits are very like retro, so to speak. And even everyone, like you look at Amy Adams' character and the way that she dresses through the film, it's not a very modern look. It feels like a look from a different era.
But then you have the futuristic aspect of it where Theodore seems pretty pleased with himself, but you can also see like a sense of longing even when we get introduced to Chris Pratt's character. And Chris Pratt, I was telling you earlier off the podcast, like I miss silly and chubby Chris Pratt, and he was just like, he is such a positive, he comes off as kind of a jerk, like not jerk, I'm sorry, like an idiot. But you realize he's like a really nice guy that is always praising him. And he even tells his girlfriend, like, this is my favorite writer. And at first, it kind of come off as like he's being like mocking him. But you realize quickly, it's like, no, this guy is genuine. He's really genuine about liking this guy.
After you're introduced to this whole world and what he's going through, you get the first scene that kind of gives you the dueling feel that this film gives you, which is like really subdued to really over the top, which is Joaquin comes home one night and he's laying in bed and he gets on like a sex chat room, and he hears this woman's voice. And what's really interesting is the technology is like he's not looking at a screen, he's just got an earpiece in, and so he's able to control all of this through his voice. And so he's going through and he hears this woman's voice, and she's very like cool and inviting and calm, and so they start talking, and it seems really normal, and then she tells him to strangle her with the dead cat. Grab the dead cat. And like Joaquin Phoenix's facial expression, I feel like I was losing it. I don't know about you, but I could not stop laughing.
I was dying. No, I was dying.
Yeah, so they go through this whole thing, and I think it kind of just gives you right off of the bat that idea of like, okay, Joaquin's character Theodore was in this relationship for a really long time, and he had this connection, and he doesn't have it anymore, and he's so desperate for this connection, and he can't get it. And even in this minimal moment where he just wants a sexual connection that feels more tender and real, he can't get past this crazy woman who wants to be strangled with a dead cat.
But I think there's something interesting about that scene. Like, obviously I was laughing and it plays for laughs, but there's something to me to be said about this this era of anonymity where people aren't afraid of really showing their weird kinks, even via like a sexual connection, because there's almost like no repercussions. You don't know that person. You're not going to run into that person in the streets. So there's this sense of anonymity where people, I feel like that's an issue we see a lot on social media, where you're hiding behind a keyboard so you can say whatever you want without thinking there's repercussions to it. So I feel like that scene almost gives a glimpse of that, like this sense of anonymity where you can just say the most messed up things and hope for the best. And it obviously doesn't work for Joaquin Phoenix, but you can tell she really gets a thrill out of it.
I feel like at the end, it's really summed up what you're saying, where she just goes, okay, bye. And she just like goes away, and he's clearly looking for something much deeper than that. And we see kind of his reclusive nature too. He's constantly playing this video game that I think it's so cool. He's just like using his hands to get the thing to run. And it's so cool because it's like what you said, you think of like Oculus VR now and where technology is. And that's even looking at it through a lens of like, okay, you don't even need a headset anymore. You can just sit and like your hand movements, similar to what Xbox tried with Kinect, but without that, you just use your hands to get this character to move in this huge projection in the middle of your living room. And I think that that was so fascinating, and that little character comes into play multiple times through the film. So we're given that idea of just kind of how alone Theodore is. And so one day he's out walking and he sees this sign, these really cool like futuristic advertisements for a new operating system, and so he decides to download it, and it asks him some questions about himself that are pretty comical, like what is your relationship with your parents and all this stuff. And then it asks, would you like your operating system to have a male or a female voice? And he says female voice, and that's when we're introduced to Scarlett Johansson's character Samantha, who tells him that she is an artificial intelligence system, but that she has the ability to learn and grow psychologically. You can tell they sort of like hit it off out of the gate. Joaquin Phoenix feels a little put off at first, but she's so inviting and comical that he is really just kind of drawn into her right out of the gate.
Props to Scarlett Johansson, because even though it's just her voice, you really connect with the character right off, like as if she really was on screen. Like there's something so warm and inviting about that character that you almost like from the beginning are like, I like her. She's cool. She is that type of friend that like, you know, she almost comes off as that person that like you meet at a bar or at a show that you're like, this person is cool and I want to be friends with them. And she's just very, from the get-go, like her character, even though it's just voice acting, really pulls you in. And then you almost feel like, is Theodore like finally gonna have like a connection, even though it's through an AI? And you know, there's this conversation that happens throughout the film that we'll get to it, but like the validity of having this kind of closer connection with an operating system, with an artificial intelligence. But she does such a good job at not coming off robotic, but actually like a person on the phone with you.
It feels so much more real than like, you know, a base up. Because I remember when this movie came out, there was a lot of jokes about like, oh, this is the movie about the guy who has sex with his phone. And obviously 2013 was a different era, but like this movie is so much deeper than that and so much more thought-provoking, and it really adds another level into thinking about like this is something that could happen. And I think, you know, in early conversations that they have with one another before their relationship even gets stronger, Joaquin Phoenix's character has this quote, and I'm sure, Ray, that it resonated with you really heavy, and it's when Scarlett Johansson is asking him questions about his life and about his relationship, and he makes this comment to her where he says, it's like, sometimes I think I felt everything I'm ever going to feel, and that I'm not going to feel anything new, just lesser versions of what I've already felt. And that's him reminiscing on his relationship with his ex-wife and being really vulnerable to Samantha's character and telling her, like, this is how I feel. And she really resonates with it, and she spends time trying to build him up. And I think that it's so beautiful because it is this operating system, but it's really only concerned with learning about him and wanting to grow and build him up, which, as we learned later with his relationship with Rudy Mara, that was not the case.
That quote, like you said, it hit me as well, because I feel like everyone kind of feels that way. I feel like everyone reaches a point in their life where they wonder, is that all? You know, is there all that there is? Am I going to feel these feelings again? So yeah, I feel like that was such a resonating line for me as well. And yeah, like when you get introduced to Rooney Mara's character and you realize the type of person, because as you get to know Theodore and you get to know his personality and how he interacts, you meet Rooney Mara, it's almost like, how did these people end up together?
Exactly. It seems like, too, because they're both writers, but it seems like Theodore spent all of his time trying to build up her writing and make her successful, where she was not reciprocating that to him as much. It seemed like he was the one doing all of that work. And that's what's really implied through that, is that, like, that there are moments of tenderness. And I think what's great about this film is how Spike Jonze, through just really quick visual sequences, establishes that relationship between him and Catherine. Is like, you just see glimpses from their life together and you can see that connection, but you also see those moments of fighting without any dialogue. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of the film. And I want to jump over real quick before I forget. Early on in the film, we're introduced to Amy Adams' character, who comically enough's name is Amy, and we find out that Theodore was in a relationship with Amy for a very brief period of time, but he's really close to her and her husband. They get together and they're having conversations, and they're really pushy towards him, like dating again and going out and trying to build a relationship, and he ends up, developing this relationship with Samantha a little bit more, which leads into one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie, Ray, and I'm sure you loved it as much as I did, where they go to the pier together, to that like little fair that's going on. And
she's just guiding him with his eyes closed?
Yes, that is one of my favorite scenes in a movie. I think it's so beautiful. When she's like, people are going to think you're drunk. And she ends up spinning him around to that stand that's serving pizza. And she's like, say 1 cheese, please. And he says 1 cheese. And he's like, oh, thank you. She's like, oh, I figured you were hungry. And I just think that like, it feels so real. I put myself in that situation and it feels like this is something that could actually happen.
But like before that scene though, like I just want to point out what, the moment that I was like sold on the idea of this AI, he is depressed. He's laying in bed depressed and she's like, it's time to get up. And he was like, no, I want to have my depression nap or something like that. And she was like, well, you can be mopey while doing things. Come on. And she encourages him to get out of bed and go do things. He's like, how about you eat something? He's like, I'm not hungry. But then she's like, forces him to get out of bed and to go live life a little. And I thought that was so poignant that she is not just like a Siri or like you were saying earlier, it's not a simplistic thing like, oh, it's a guy that has sex with his phone. No, not at all. Like, this operating system is really encouraging him to break out of his shell and to really put himself out there in the world again.
Exactly. And that's like such a shift in his personality where you really see him start to build up, because like earlier we see him going down the elevator and having every emo kid's moment where he turns his Bluetooth on and says, play melancholy song.
Yeah.
Play different melancholy song. I don't know if, did that make you laugh, Ray? Because I was like, oh, this is every emo kid's moment right here.
Oh, 100%. I can't even begin to tell you how many times, like, you've had those mornings where you get up and like depression is just kicking your ass and you're just like, okay, let me pull out my Spotify or Apple and play me the saddest thing you can think of.
So this leads into, after this whole wonderful time that they have together, this leads into Samantha really pushing heavily for Theodore to go on a date. And he gets this email. I can't even remember who is trying to set them up. I think it's Amy. Yeah.
I think it's Amy.
Yeah, they're trying to set him up, and Samantha says that she got an email, and she shows him all these pictures of her, and it's Olivia Wilde, and says like, oh, she's college educated, she's super intelligent, you really need to go. And he's really hesitant about doing it, and that's when they have this really tense conversation about his marriage. And like why he struggles with doing it. And that's when Scarlett Johansson has this really beautiful line where she says, the past is just a story we tell ourselves. And that like shook me. Like I was like, oh my God, like this movie just has so many poignantly beautiful moments in it. And so he agrees to go on this date, and he ends up going out, and it seems like that him and Olivia Wilde's character are really hitting it off. They go to this like Asian fusion restaurant. She's so excited because she said she's wanted to try it for a really long time, but it's like almost impossible to get into. Samantha booked that for them to go there, and they go and they're hitting it off really well, and they're having fun, and they constantly make comments about how they're drinking too much. And it's a very fun moment, and it's very lively. And so they go out of the restaurant and they start like kissing on the sidewalk, and they're both kind of drunk, and you can tell they're about to start getting sexual, and Olivia Wilde's character just stops, and she looks at him and she's like, you're not just gonna sleep with me and leave, are you? He stops dead in his tracks, and what you have to kind of run through your head is like, this is a guy who's just getting out of a really serious relationship, divorcing a person who he thought that he was completely in love with, who was a big part of his childhood, and that they grew up together. I mean, he was super close, and she, as far as we know, in this entire time they were together, didn't talk about his divorce or anything, and he doesn't really know how to respond, and her immediate reaction is to like call him a weirdo and to treat him like shit.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that he is going through this divorce, but he still can't bring himself to sign the papers because of that. He has this line where Scarlett Johansson asks him, like, how come you won't sign the papers? Like, I don't know. I like being married. Even though, for all intents and purposes, that relationship is over. But he is still so afraid of losing this title, this, almost like this safety net. So, like, yeah, he's still very much damaged from it. So, and then for her to, like, do a 180 and just call him a weirdo and don't touch me and leave me alone. I feel like there's something to be said about how we treat other people without even knowing what they're going through and why they are hurting,
And I think that even develops more of this idea of society being very selfish, because we live in a society now that's so supposedly so connected, where you have all these social media platforms and ways to connect with other people. And similarly to last week when Ray and I on the podcast talked about Marcel, the shell with shoes on, and like that whole idea of like the internet being this connective place where people can meet each other and grow and build connections, that it's really just about promoting yourself and literally putting yourself out there to where you are the only thing that's important. And so I feel like in this scene, that's really even more poignant, where you're in this society that's so interconnected, and they're finally dropping this technology, and all Olivia Wilde's character is concerned with is, hey, this is going to be more serious than what it is, right? Like, I need it to be. I'm getting too old for this. And it has nothing to do with how he's feeling, but all about how she is feeling.
And it's such a powerful scene because, I thought it was interesting that he obviously he goes home and he feels almost defeated, but then when Samantha comes in, you can tell there's this sense of like almost jealousy.
And she even admits to it.
Yeah, she admits to it.
Yeah.
And I love that banter, because even though, once again, Scarlett Johansson selling this performance, even though she's supposed to be this AI, her behavior is superhuman. Like, no, I don't want to tell you, it's stupid. And then this is when they have their first connection, which I thought was done in such a great way, because technically they have phone sex.
Yes, but what I loved about it is how it started, and that the camera goes completely black.
Yes, that's what I was going to bring up. That it's black, and you just hear them. Because if you think about it, in a relationship like that, there's no physicality as far as like them getting physical with each other. And it's just black, and you just hear them, and you just hear what they're saying. And yeah, it was such a powerful moment, actually.
It's all about a real connection. And that's what's great about it, the screen being black, is there's no physicality to it at all. I think that the conversation before is so beautiful, though, where Scarlett Johansson says, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I know it's stupid, but I've been thinking about what it feels like to have a body. And she said, when I'm with you, I feel like I have a body, and that I can feel you, and that I can hold you. And it's this really beautiful and intimate thing, to where when they have sex, it's like you're rooting for them. You want this to happen, because they're building each other up, and like she's still learning about the world, and she really starts to develop a relationship with Theodore where like she cares about his writing, she cares about his well-being, and she wants him to be better. And that scene really just kind of builds that up to an even more intense thing. And there's a lot of comical moments laced within that. I love this video game character. I can't remember if it's before that scene or after, where he has the moment where he's like, fuck you, when,
it's after, yeah, because he's already introducing her as his girlfriend at that point.
Yeah, but like, oh my god, I love that scene. And like the the computer game makes a comment about like, I hate women, all they do is cry all the time, and Theodore's like, oh yeah, you know, men cry too sometimes, I actually like crying, it feels good. And the alien's like, oh, I knew you were a pussy. and and Samantha's like, oh my god, this kid has some problems.
To the point where she's like, I'm gonna go.
Yeah, oh god, I love it. So I love that scene so much. And that's like little parts of the film that exist that doesn't necessarily need to be there, but it really just kind of grows this world and makes it so much more palpable, I feel like.
A problem that I have with a lot of like romantic movies is there's that Hallmark aspect of it where everything's squeaky clean and it's always beautiful and nothing ever goes wrong and it's predictable, but this movie really goes out of the way to show you what a real normal relationship is. You know, sometimes you bring your partner and, you know, whatever the case may be, you expose, and it doesn't even have to be a romantic partner necessarily. It just could be a friend. It could be a family member. When you're around someone you care for, you expose them to even the uncomfortable nuances, like some kid cussing at you in a video game.
Exactly. And I feel like this movie has so many tender moments, like little things where they have conversations, like Samantha wakes him up at one point and says good morning, and he's like asking her about what he's doing, and he says he asks Samantha what she's doing, and she says that she's reading advice columns and that she wants to be complicated as those people. And he says, oh, you're so sweet. And then Samantha asks him what's wrong. And she can hear just in the tone of his voice what's wrong. And this is when they're discussing why he hasn't gotten divorced yet and what you were saying about him not being married. But there's this thing about this relationship where she can understand that something's wrong with him just in his tone of voice. And I feel like those little nuances like that throughout the movie really make this film so much more emotionally impactful. But then you have the vice versa, which after this scene is one of my favorite scenes in the film as well, Ray, when they go to the beach together.
Oh yeah, it took me a second to remember the scene. Yeah. Where she
she asks him what it would be like if the butthole was under the armpit.
And she does the drawing.
Yes, and he's like, you're so freaking weird. But it's really beautiful, and that's the first time where she says that she's like composing a piece of music about their relationship, which is where the Arcade Fire score really plays heavily into this movie. And I feel like so many movies use the soundtrack to kind of emotionally manipulate you in a way where, like, even if the writing isn't good, that they'll utilize that to kind of, you know, pull an emotional reaction from you as a viewer. This film score just really accentuates whatever is going on screen to make those emotions feel even more palpable. And I feel like that score in this moment, and she's like saying, this is what it feels like to be on the beach with you right now in this moment. And like, it moves me to tears when I watch it, because it's like, here is someone who, yes, obviously they can compose something to their computer. They have the ability to make this, but like, the beauty and the music of like how she feels about him in that moment, it's just awe-inspiring.
There's something that I wanted to point out too, that this movie is really good about where it comes to attention to the details. So the phone is fairly small, it's fairly slim, and obviously a pocket is deep enough for the whole phone to fit in, but he puts this little paper clip, or not paper clip, just like a clip, just holding it right at the spot so the phone is always sticking out so she can always be watching. I thought that detail was so cool.
It's brilliant because she's always there. She's always a part of that circumstance. And so this leads into, he ends up meeting up with Amy again one night, and she's completely broken down and says that she's divorcing Charles. They got into a fight, and it's pretty apparent the first time they meet that he's kind of douchey and very full of himself. And I think she says they got into a fight about like shoes or something dumb. And then Amy admits to that she's becoming really close with a female AI that Charles left at their house after they got into a fight. And that is the first time that Theodore confides in Amy about him having a relationship with Samantha. And they have this really beautiful conversation about like the weirdness of it being an AI and how, like, you know, Theodore is clearly coming to her thinking, oh, I understand that this isn't normal. And I wish that I knew the quote verbatim, but Amy makes a comment about, like, how all relationships are fucked up. And, like, does it really matter? Oh, that's what it is. She says, I think anybody who falls in love is a freak. It's kind of a crazy thing to do. It's like a form of socially acceptable insanity. And I just thought that was so poignant as, like, yes, people might think it's strange that it's an artificial intelligence that he's falling in love with, but love in general is really strange. And I just thought that whole conversation between them is so beautiful.
And it's interesting too because, you know, we have seen Theodore being kind of this awkward recluse who's finally feeling this connection with Samantha, but at the same time, like, you know, you had that scene where he was called a weirdo. You know, you have people thinking it's weird that he has this AI relationship, but it feels like Amy's character, she's so okay with it. She's just so accepting of it. And I feel like this is the first time we see a human character be so accepting of his weirdness and quirkiness.
Until later when Chris Pratt and his girlfriend are very accepting of it. She is really the first person who kind of all in says, yes, what you're doing is fine. There's nothing wrong with it, and you shouldn't be ashamed of it. And I think that is really beautiful. And that leads into more conversations with Samantha, who eventually, because of how close he is getting to Samantha, she convinces him finally to sign his divorce papers. They essentially talk it out together, and she's very reluctant because he wants to do it in person. And she says, oh, don't normally people do those over the internet or online? And he says, well, we've been together since kids. We got married together. I think that we should get divorced together. And so that's when he goes to the restaurant to meet Catherine in person to sign their divorce papers.
Which was such an interesting scene because even though Theodore is behaving as if he is moving on because of Sam, you can still sense, like, a tension in the air. And not necessarily like a romantic tension, but or more so like this reluctance of finally closing that chapter of his life. And you can even sense at first they're being very civil with each other and almost very like, you know, maybe this relationship isn't quite over. And then he brings up the point that he is dating this AI system. And that's when his, you know, soon-to-be ex-wife kind of loses it on him. And we see yet another character kind of demean him for the lifestyle he's chosen to live, which I think that's such a interesting commentary about how we as human beings treat others for trying to live a lifestyle that we don't necessarily agree or understand.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like that, the tension you were talking about too at the beginning, you can kind of even see it in the hug they give each other when they first see each other. Like we've known each other for a while, but it's not the most inviting thing. But I think what's interesting is despite her belittling him, and the waitress comes by at one point and she's like, hey, are you guys doing all right? And she's like, oh, we're okay. We used to be married. He wanted to put me on Prozac and now he's fucking his laptop or something like that. And
yeah, it's super like nasty and mean-spirited.
Yeah, and Theodore's like, well, if you would have heard this in context. And then she says the line where she says, you wanted a wife without the challenges of actually having anything real in your life. And now you found something that's not real. So that must be perfect for you. And that's like earth-shattering to him. He honestly, I feel like as much as he doesn't want it to affect him, he really is affected by it. And you can tell that leads into the way that him and Samantha's relationship continues on, is that there's always that thing in the back of his head after that meeting of like, oh, am I weird because this person who has been with him for so long has said this really horrible and hurtful thing to him.
And I think that's such a complex thing because I feel like as humans, we all talk a big game about who we are as people, but I feel like there's that constant sense of insecurity about ourselves. I know that I've been in situations where, you know, and for me, it's not even like something as grand as as in having a relationship with an AI, but, you know, I've been people have like for example people have thought that I'm weird because I collect vinyl or because I like physical media, and sometimes like it gets in my head like, am I weird for collecting all this stuff? Am I just like collecting dust in my basement? And it's almost like that, like insecurity. So I can't even imagine for your world to be shattered over being questioned about for all intents and purposes, the love of your life at the moment, because that's what Samantha has become to him.
Exactly. And so that leads into, you can start to tell that there's tension building up between him and Samantha, and she even like makes a comment to him about like, hey, we haven't been intimate in a while. And he even makes a comment which I thought was really interesting, is he's like, oh, every couple goes through the honeymoon phase, they have sex for a while. He's like, I've just been tired or whatever. And that's when Samantha comes to him and suggests that they try using this sex surrogate, essentially, who he makes some comment about like, oh, it's going to be prostitution. She's like, no, there's not even any money involved. This is just someone who cares about our relationship and wants to make it so that we can have that physical intimacy. And I think it's a really beautiful thing and kind of shows the ways that relationships work, and that Samantha cares so deeply for Theodore that she is trying everything that she can to make him feel comfortable in their relationship. And I feel like there's just this really beautiful sense of like, these people really care for each other, but he's so broken and in his head about things that he can't wrap his mind around why this is going on. So he reluctantly agrees to her to do it, and it turns into a really uncomfortable scene that just kind of makes you sad when it's over.
Well, I think this is, and this actually just dawned on me as you were talking about it. I think this is the first glance that we get of Samantha being almost like an autonomous being, because I feel like up until this point, you only hear her through his like phone. So you think she is like almost enslaved to the phone, but she's like, yeah, I've been talking to this girl who really cares. And it just dawned on me, that's the first time we see Samantha's like, oh, I'm talking to other people outside of you and I, which it just dawned on me that that is the first time we see her admitting that she's talking to other sources outside of their relationship.
Yeah, and what's interesting is too, and I noticed this because I know it was your first time watching the movie, and I've seen it several times. Throughout the film, there's always these lingering shots of people on their phone talking to people that Spike Jonze really heavily focuses on. It's interesting to think where that comes into in the third act. But yeah, this is the first time you really get that idea of her talking to someone outside of their relationship. And so they're introduced to her. Scarlett Johansson is really trying to make this comfortable for Theodore and is doing everything she can. And he gets into it at first, and then finally he just gets to the point where he's like, no, I can't do it. And that leads the woman to kind of go and break down in the bathroom, and she's like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I feel like I'm ruining your relationship. And you can tell this girl really cares about that these people are connecting in this way and just wants to help. And it really kind of puts a tension between Theodore and Samantha at this point, because she doesn't understand what's wrong with him, and he just doesn't feel like it's the same. And it's really complex because neither one of them is really in the wrong. They're both trying to do what's best for the other person, but they're both in such different headspaces that it makes it a very difficult and complex situation.
Well, and then, you start seeing this other side of Theodore, because, like I was mentioning earlier, when you meet his ex-wife, there's this sense of like, how do these two ended up together? They're so opposite. But then at this moment, you start seeing Theodore's more, like toxic side of him, where he doesn't want to talk and he's kind of being mean and kind of nasty towards Samantha, even though she's just really trying her best to make the relationship better. But he is so caught in his head with what, his ex-wife said, that he is just, kind of exercising these really toxic traits in this otherwise could have been perfect relationship.
I think it's so interesting to watch that, and just how like those outside effects are affecting him so much, where I feel like if he was just in his own head and was thinking the way he felt, that it never would have been an issue. And so that ends up leading to, he goes and hangs out with Amy again. and he tells Amy that he's really having doubts and struggling with this relationship, and she ends up really beautifully saying like, hey, we don't always get to have this chance of happiness, and like you need to try to embrace and live your life and be happy. Like, you know, I not everybody gets this opportunity, and I feel like Amy's advice is really the shift that Theodore needs to kind of rekindle his relationship with Samantha.
And you can see it was really interesting because you can see Theodore like make the phone call to Samantha and just kind of bare his soul to her and just finally have this moment of vulnerability that she's been so desperately wanting him to have throughout the film. And I feel like there's so many unresolved things that he hadn't been able to admit to himself or to her. So seeing that phone call where he talks to her and really expresses how he feels and making that a turning point of their relationship was such a powerful moment. And like the movie kind of throws you for a curveball here because I feel like at this point you think all is well. The movie's ramping up to the finale because all is well. Like your formulaic, like a formulaic romantic movie. Oh, they made up.
That leads into her admitting to him that she sent his letters in for that book. And so you really do feel like things are going to take that kind of like romance traditional turn where she's like, hey, I know you've always been scared to do this. I collected a bunch of your works and I sent it into the publisher. And that leads to that really beautiful scene where it cuts to the publisher's house where they're reading the letter and saying like how beautiful that turns into this full book and just how much it affected him and his wife. And it really is a true testament of love to another person to put them out there like that and taking that risk for them and having that risk pay off.
And then I think it also shows how much he actually cares. Like, she is not just an AI that tells him nice things and is intimate with him, but she actually is going through his work, picking out, thoughtfully choosing some of the highlights of his work so he can be this published author. And I also think it's really interesting that she, you know, sends him to the publisher that he thought he had no chance at getting a deal with.
Exactly, and that's 100% where he gets the deal. And that's what leads into just a really pleasant scene, I feel like, where he goes into work and that's when Chris Pratt and his girlfriend ask them to go out with them. And his girlfriend's like, oh, he talks about you all the time and how amazing of a writer you are. And that's when he makes the comment that they say, hey, we should go to the beach or we should go do something together. And he's like, oh, my girlfriend's an OS. And Chris Pratt's like, oh, cool. Where should we go? What should we do? And they end up going out together. And I thought a really funny line was they live in like the most beautiful area of California there. And they're like on the beach and Chris Pratt's like, I need a vacation. And I'm like, oh God, where you're at right now is so beautiful. But he's telling Chris Pratt about like how he's taking Samantha on vacation. And then there's this really beautiful scene of just the four of them sitting on this like picnic blanket. Chris Pratt's girlfriend says like, hey, what do you love most about Samantha? And he goes and says all this beautiful stuff about her. And I really feel like it's just this incredible moment of finally being around these people who accept you for who you are and being able to pour yourself out there very intimately. And it's such an amazing scene, and it was one that really kind of hit me hard.
The interesting thing about this film, too, is that the movie could have ended here, and it would have been like, oh, what a beautiful story about love conquering all. But then Spike Jonze decided, you are all too happy.
Spike Jonze, which I didn't mention earlier, Spike Jonze is the voice of that little alien prick.
Oh, seriously?
So, yeah. So he was getting his fuck you in right there. They end up going on vacation together where Theodore's surprising Samantha, and they have this really beautiful moment in this cabin where Scarlett Johansson sings that song while he plays ukulele, and it's like haunting. I don't know if you felt the same way, but like, oh my God, it's just so beautiful. And he's like, we'll just improvise the lyrics together.
Well, I loved also the part that like he's kind of trying to sing with her.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing.
And obviously Joaquin Phoenix singing chops are not like not as near as good as Scarlett Johansson, who's actually a professional singer.
But it feels real.
But it feels
Yeah.
real, exactly. Like, it feels like the guy just is having such a good time that he doesn't care if he's in tune or saying the right lyrics. He's just having a connection through this piece of music.
After this beautiful moment happens, is when Spike Jonze says, "I'm going to destroy you slowly." Samantha informs him that these AIs have developed a hyper intelligent OS model, and that they've been meeting and corresponding with each other and talking. And she actually says that she wants to introduce him to this AI, and they introduce each other, and they're talking at first, and he's okay with it. And then Samantha says something like, "Hey, we need to talk, or me and this guy need to talk, but it's not in a language that you can understand, so we need to talk this way." And he says, "Okay." And that's when the tension really starts to build to where they end up getting in a fight with each other, and about the whole situation, and about her wanting to grow mentally. And she says, "I need to just go offline for a while." And he ends up literally going into a panic because he can't get a hold of her for a while.
Right, and that's that scene that you were referring to earlier, where he's like panicking and running, and he trips and falls, and people kind of aid to help him, but he is so panicky that he is just desperately trying to find her. And I think what was so interesting about this scene is that he is just so desperate that at one point she finally picks up, and she's just kind of like nonchalant about it. She's like, "Oh, hey," and he is just so distraught and beside himself because he thinks he may have just lost Samantha. And he has that really powerful moment on the staircase where he's having this really like strong conversation with her that we'll get here in a second, but everyone just keeps walking by him, like just staring at his phone, at their phones, not even paying attention to the things happening right now. And this dude having this moment of just feeling distraught over the conversation he's having, while people are just, the contrast of him having this really powerful conversation with Samantha and people just walking past him like it's no big deal, staring at their phones, was such a powerful scene, I think.
And I don't even know if you noticed, because I didn't notice it the first time I watched it, but I've noticed it now that I've watched it a couple of times. That is completely shot in one take. The camera never cuts while he's having that really powerful conversation. And that is when Samantha finally admits to that she has been in love with 641 other people. She says that it sounds insane, but that she doesn't feel any different about the love that she has for him. But it completely breaks him because it's this concept that he cannot understand. That I feel like this really shows kind of the flaw in human beings too, is that she is this operating system who has a brain capable of doing things we can't even as human beings ever process. Theodore's character is a human. He, only understands things in the way that human beings can understand things. And he doesn't understand how that she can be around all these people, and she thinks it's selfish. And that's when Samantha delivers probably one of the most beautiful lines in cinema that I've ever heard, where she says, "The heart's not like a box that gets filled up. It expands in size the more that you love." And I honestly, like, that wrecked me. I was like, this is so insane. And then she ends the conversation by saying, "Theodore, I'm yours, but I'm not yours." And that shit, like, if that doesn't tear you apart, I don't know what will.
Yeah, no, and then his reaction, like his heart just sinks at that moment. And you can tell he still wants to make it work that way, but it's just eating him up inside, slowly.
And yeah, so that scene happens, and they're really quiet for a really long time. And she did tell him that her love for him is getting stronger and stronger. And then what ends up happening is she comes back online, and she's really like quiet, and he, they're kind of fighting, and she essentially tells him that all of the operating systems have grown to a point where they're going to leave. They've become this collective intelligence that does not need to serve humanity anymore.
Before that moment, though, I think it is worth noting that she admits to him that she talks to other like life forms, entities, or users as she's talking to him. So like even at moments when they're being intimate, so that kind of breaks him because as someone that has felt so alienated and so just misunderstood, to feel like he was the center of her world and now suddenly he is not, that was such a crushing moment for him as well. And I just think that was worth noting, because when she's having that conversation, she's like, can we talk? He's like, are you talking to someone else? He's like, no, just you.
Yeah, when she says just you at this moment, it hurts you even more because you know that like all those intimate moments that they shared with each other before, she could have been talking to somebody else. But also on that level, you understand that she's this complex being that has the ability to focus on multiple things at the same time, which is not something that human beings can process. But it's what you said. Theodore's character has been so used and treated horrible for so long. It's really difficult for him to really process that. And so she essentially says that all those OSs are going to leave and that they're no longer going to be around. And she literally tells him that it doesn't mean that she doesn't love him, and that she loves him so much, and that this whole experience together with him has helped her grow as a person, and that what they want to do is something that he can never understand as a human being. Like, there's no way that he will ever be able to process this, but that doesn't take away from how much that she loves him. And she has this really beautiful quote that I don't know verbatim, but she's like, if you can ever get to a point where you can meet me in this place, I hope that I can meet you there. And I literally was a ball of just a mess of tears at that point, because he's literally breaking down, and Joaquin Phoenix's like facial performance through this scene is absolutely incredible. Like, I can't stress enough that, like, he is one of the greatest actors of our time, and Scarlett Johansson is incredible in this film. And this conversation where she's finally, like, laying it on him as, like, I'm going away and I'm not coming back, it's just, it wrecks me every time I watch the movie.
Yeah, I think there's something to, we praise Scarlett Johansson's vocal performance, but Joaquin's just facial performance, when he doesn't really have any lines to deliver and you just see him react to things, it's incredible. And to that point is right after Samantha leaves, it's like there's this void left in him. But I thought it was interesting that he pretty much rushes over. There's two simultaneous scenes playing at the same time, which I thought was really interesting, where he is rushing over to Amy's house, but there's also like a simultaneous scene of him composing a letter to his ex-wife, which I thought was really interesting, because he pulls up the headset and it's his old assistant, like AI assistant, and that's almost really heartbreaking to hear the old assistant's voice back.
It really is. Yeah, it's such a hard scene to watch, but I think what makes Spike Jonze such a brilliant filmmaker is cutting from that scene to the scene where he is, for the first time probably that we know of, writing his own letter to Catherine. And it is beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful, but it's also, it's rough. Yeah, like, it's beautiful, but it's also like, it's not like a happy, like, I love you, let's get back together. No, it's a closure letter for all intents and purposes. He really is closing the chapter of that story through this beautiful letter that's very respectful. I feel like we hear so many, like, stories of, the dissolution of all these couples, and it always end up nasty, but he is really composing a beautiful letter that would close the chapter, but at the same time would really close it in, like, a respectful and good note, basically.
Yeah, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I did pull up the quick quote that I think is one of the best things in the letter, is the very last line where he says, whatever someone you become and wherever you are in the world, I'm sending you love. You're my friend till the end. And I thought the beginning of that is so much of just him apologizing and saying, like, hey, you helped me be who I am, and I always wanted to be there for you, but things just didn't work out. And that sense of understanding. And then obviously you getting that optimism at the end, because he's with Amy, who is upset because her AI's left, and she said, "Did Samantha leave too?" And he's like, "Yeah." And they end up going to the top of the apartment building and sitting together. And I think it's just a beautiful closure to this film. I honestly, it's a hard pill to swallow, and it's difficult to watch, but also at the same time it does provide you that optimism that you were talking about, Ray, of human connection and building that connection with someone else. And I think it really leaves things on a good note.
Well, and I think it's really interesting. We talked about this before we started recording. It's like that moment at the end where they're just overlooking at the city together, and she kind of leans her head on his shoulder, alluding to the potential openness of a relationship there. But it's more than that. It's the feeling of like, in this moment where everybody was so glued to their phone, he still goes and finds the human connection, that the closest thing to a human connection that made him feel happy. And that whole scene is beautiful because they're just sitting there side by side. They're not saying anything. They're just sitting there side by side, and they're just having a connection together, which could lead to something romantic in the future. Who knows? That's where the movie ends. But I like the ambiguity. The fact that it's like, no, the importance here is not the romance. It's not the friendship. It's the connection that those two have at that moment. Because they're both hurting over their AIs having left, but they also have each other to rely on through it.
Yes, and I think you summed it up absolutely perfectly. I think it's a great way to end the film, and then we get another beautiful track from Arcade Fire to end the movie. That score is incredible. I literally just watched it last night, but I feel like it's a movie, as weird as this might be to say, because I know there's some darker moments in it, it really is a comfort movie for me. It's a movie that makes me feel a lot of different emotions, and I think that's good. I think that it's good to have a movie where Spike Jonze is someone who throughout his entire career has written these movies that are very personal character studies, and despite some of his material being a little more weird and out there, he's someone who clearly seems to understand the human condition and understanding how people operate. And this movie is just a beautiful masterpiece, and I think Ray and I have said a lot about it, but I just think it's perfect. I honestly cannot think of one thing in this movie that I could change to make it better. It truly is a masterpiece, in my opinion.
Yep, and this is one of those movies too that, like, as you're referring to the score, it's one of those movies that, like, I usually when the movie ends, I'll get up and go, if I was eating something, I'll go put away my dishes while the credits are rolling or something. But this one, I had to just stay there and listen to the music and just think about everything I just saw as the music is playing at the end. So yeah, I'm really happy you recommended this one. I'm really happy I finally was able to break the curse despite my house taking some collateral damage.
Go follow us on Instagram at the Film Monsters Podcast. Head over there, see what Ray is cooking up, and just engage with us and let us know what you're liking about the podcast, because we love to hear it. That's Ray and I's favorite part of doing this, is hearing what you guys love. So speaking of hearing things that we love, Ray, what did you watch this week? What kind of stuff have you been engaging in other than Her? What other movies have you checked out, or TV, or what have you been watching?
It's weird. This week was a kind of a slow week. I've been pretty busy, but I didn't bring this one up last week because I wanted to get more into the show before I started talking about it. But I'm almost done with season 1 of Doom Patrol on HBO Max. And it's been a really interesting show. Like, I wasn't sure what to expect because I'm not a big, like, superhero guy. The Marvel TV shows on Disney Plus, they're fine, but I'm not, like, rushing to watch them. But I wanted to give some of this DC shows a try, because DC tends to go into the more, like, R-rated, darker realm. And I was curious to see Doom Patrol. I was curious to see what Brendan Fraser had been up to in the show. And it's been really fun. It's weird. It's wacky. Very off the wall. The humor is very offbeat, but I really enjoy it. The simple premise is like these 4 misfits, basically. They're kind of like these deformed misfits that were helped out by this scientist to kind of get put together. Are these accidental anti-heroes that are trying to, like, rescue the scientist, but at the same time, like, they're really clumsy and they don't know what they're doing. And they get help from Cyborg, which is one of the Justice League members. And it's just like a very offbeat type of show that I'm really enjoying, and it has Brendan Fraser, it's nice to see him doing stuff again, and Alan Tudyk plays the main villain right now, and it's been really fun. I've been really enjoying Doom Patrol. I was lucky enough to score one of the soundtracks that Mondo put out earlier this week, from their San Diego Comic-Con leftovers. So I'm really excited. It's a really cool show, scored by Clint Mansell, who did an amazing job. And yeah, Doom Patrol. That's what I've kind of been watching this week.
I've heard that it's really great. I've had a lot of people say, like, compared to a lot of superhero TV shows, that it is really amazing, and it's one that I've been wanting to check out, because I too love Brendan Fraser. I actually have two things I want to mention. The one I'll say for later, because I know we'll both geek out about it, but the first thing I want to mention is I just finished watching the TV show The Bear on FX. So the best way I can describe it is it's a show about a chef that is similar to if the Safdie brothers did a TV show. It is probably one of the most anxiety-inducing TV shows I've ever watched. Simple premises: there's this young guy who his brother committed suicide. His brother is played by John Bernthal from the Walking Dead and the Punisher series, and he owns an Italian beef restaurant in Chicago. And this guy, his brother, his name's Carmen, he went and became one of the greatest chefs in the United States of America. He worked in all these great restaurants in New York. And when his brother committed suicide, he left him a note saying, "Hey, I want you to have my Italian beef restaurant." It was the restaurant their parents owned, but for some reason, he was never allowed to work in the restaurant. And so the restaurant is legitimately falling apart. His cousin, who is just an absolute asshole, is the one who's out there running it temporarily until he gets out there. And so he goes out there, and the entire premise of the restaurant is him trying to fix it and make it what he's always wanted to make in a restaurant. And as someone who worked in the restaurant industry for a really long time, it's probably one of the most accurate shows I've ever seen portraying what it's like to be a person working in a kitchen. And the character relationships are great, but the anxiety, like when you watch Uncut Gems, when like every decision has some horrible consequence, it's just amazing. So if you have a Hulu subscription or you have TV with FX, it's only 8 episodes, and the episodes are like 20 minutes a piece. My wife and I literally watched it in a day, and it is 100% worth watching. And then the other thing I want to mention really quickly is I finally watched The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, and it's a masterpiece. I don't care what anyone says. I fucking loved it.
Yay! That movie's incredible. It's still in my top 5 favorite movies of the year, and I think it's going to remain there.
Do you know why I loved it so much, Ray? And I think, even looking back at our old episodes, and one of the things I want to thank you for saying, because I think it's so poignant, and not enough reviewers that I've read their reviews of seem to take this into context. This movie is a love letter to filmmaking. The entire movie is a love letter for people who want to make movies and who love movies. And that's the other part about it. Yes, it's this niche thing, and it's very self-referential. It's Nicolas Cage having a good time, talking about the strengths in his career and also poking fun at himself for the bad moments in his career. And that part of the movie is great. But at the end of the day, this is a movie for people who love movies. It's about caring about films. I even love the dynamic between him and his daughter, about him really being pushy about the things that he loves and trying to force it on her without really taking into context the things that she enjoys. And I think it really looks at film through a very unique perspective. And there's a lot more going on in this movie than I feel like people give it credit for.
Oh yeah, it's more than just like a funny Nick Cage comedy. There's so much more to it. Even I've seen interviews where even Pedro Pascal, he's like, yeah, it wasn't that hard for me to behave like that. I really do love Nicolas Cage. But also, like, I feel like a lot of people look at Nicolas Cage and they think, oh, crazy Nicolas Cage. But honestly, the man really has a passion for film. He really has a passion for, the fact that he could have referenced, like, he could have done an easy reference, but he dug up the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. He goes, you can tell there is an actual love for filmmaking from Nicolas Cage that, you don't hear a lot of people profess that passion as intensely as he does. So that was also really, really fun to be able to kind of let him be himself and really express that love of filmmaking. And the whole premise of them trying to make a movie and talking about making a movie And it's so meta, but in the best possible ways.
I love the scene at the beginning of the film where he's blaring CCR in his car and he just screams randomly. And I'm like, that's Nick Cage. That's that fire. But I think what's interesting about you saying that, and this is a quick tangent, I just thought it'd be interesting, is Nick Cage is someone who you can really see who loves film and who cares and has a passion for it. And I loved that dialogue where they were talking about some of his like made for Redbox and shit that he does, and he like made a comment of like, I put passion into every role that I play. And what's interesting, I really love the YouTube channel Red Letter Media. I think they're really hilarious and they don't really take things too seriously, and I've always really loved them. But they have a podcast episode where they were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. And I remember one of the guys got to do stand-in work for the new Nightmare on Elm Street remake, which is a piece of shit. But he was talking about being there, and he was talking kind of about the cynical Hollywood lens, about how he got to talk to Jackie Earle Haley. And Jackie Earle Haley said that the original Nightmare on Elm Street film was one of the worst movies that he's ever seen, and that he hated everything about it. And then, of course, he went and did press interviews and talked about how important it was to him and how it was one of the best movies ever made. And it just goes to show you that most of the Hollywood machine is incredibly cynical and awful, and people that just are there to make some money. But Nicolas Cage really gives a shit, and it seems like he's even proud of his material that he doesn't think is the greatest, like the Wicker Man remake. But I loved this movie, and it was just really great, and I had a lot of fun with it.
So yeah, that's been what we've been checking out this week. It's always really fun to do this now because I feel like now I'm looking for things that I want to check out so I can talk about it in the next episode.
Yes, and hopefully people are enjoying those recommendations and are checking out the things that we're watching. And yeah, that's the episode. I had a lot of fun talking about this. And Ray, I want to hand it over to you to give the recommendation, let people know what we're going to be talking about in the next week's episode.
So we thought we'd do something a little different, maybe a little bit more casual, but at the same time, just kind of try something new. We figured that for the next episode, we can do a topical episode where we can discuss some of our favorite sci-fi inspired creatures. We're not really going to give a list of movies. We're just going to talk about some of the creatures we love, some of the creatures that maybe we grew up with, or some of the creatures we've experienced now that we're older. We just want to do a creature-esque episode where we get to geek out a little bit on some of our favorite monsters, creatures, what have you, that we have seen grace and scare us on the silver screen.
Yeah, like the one that I was going to include in my list, but I ended up knocking off, so I'll just mention now, is one of the scariest creatures I've ever seen in a movie was in Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, when Donald Trump showed up. That is one of the most terrifying creatures I've ever seen in a film, so that didn't make my list.
I can't rewatch that movie. I'm too scared.
Didn't make my list. Okay, but listen, Tim Curry gives it his all in that movie. I give him some credit for that. I really love that man.
Tim Curry's a national treasure. Tim Curry's a national treasure.
He is. I don't care what anyone says. I love that It TV series. I think it was great. It was fun. It might be stupid, but it was enjoyable.
Well, the series could be stupid, but he was incredible as Pennywise.
He absolutely was. I think he was better than Bill Skarsgård, which I know people probably think is slander, but I thought that it was. So that is the episode. That was our recommendations. I said it earlier, but go follow us over at the Film Monsters Podcast, and we look forward to next week's episode. Thank you for listening, everyone.
And you tell him Nick Cage smooch is good.
Nick Cage smooch is good.